Hi, I'm Stormy. I've worked in archives and libraries for the past 10 years. History, genealogy, and queer studies are all passions of mine. I'm bringing them all together in this video in the hopes that you'll see what I'm passionate about and want to join me in some queer genealogy. So, what is queer genealogy? Simply put, it's queer folks telling queer stories. Queer people have existed as long as any other humans. However, our stories are often lost to history, deliberately hidden or misinterpreted by heteronormativity. Recovering these stories requires reading between the lines. Telling queer stories not only reminds the world that queer people have always been a part of it, connecting to our queer ancestors can provide us with a way to set expectations for our queer families. By including queer stories in our family stories, we are normalizing queer love and gender expression within our families. Traditional family research ignores family members who fail to complete heterosexual milestones, such as marriage or bearing children. This, often unintentionally, prunes queer stories from the family tree. Many in the queer community know the pain of rejection from their biological families. We have historically had to make our own families that fall outside of the Western colonial norm. Queer genealogy creates a framework for telling those stories, regardless of where they fit on a traditional pedigree chart. Rather than a single family tree, queer folks have a whole forest to explore. Traditional genealogy spaces have made little room for queer ancestors. In 2019, Family Search added the ability to include same-sex couples in their family trees. Even as recently as 2023, the Family Search blog was still justifying this change as a decision to allow for the most accurate representation of records possible and not to be interpreted as support for gay marriage. Ancestry.com and other family tree creation sites have also added the ability to include same-sex partners in the years since 2019. However, this ability to add marriage partners of the same binary gender is the only distinctly queer inclusion to be found in mainstream genealogy. Is the ability to be included on a traditional family tree meaningful representation? Adding queer relationships on these family tree programs often requires extra steps that are harder to navigate than their hetero counterparts. This requires additional knowledge that it's not only possible to show alternative relationships, set multiple sets of parents or partners, and other hallmarks of queer families in genealogy software. One must know that, and then put in the extra work to use these often hidden features. These family tree programs also only allow for binary gender options, the only non-binary option being unknown. This fails to represent intersex, trans, non-binary, and culturally specific gender identities. Even once a queer person is added, many genealogy programs will continue to prompt the user to add children or a spouse to any record of a person who lived to adulthood. Heteronormative milestones are still seen as the building blocks of genealogy. Now, I understand if many queer folks are turned off from doing genealogy based on these mediocre attempts to include us by mainstream genealogy. Acknowledging our existence should be the standard, not the bare minimum. However, if we avoid participation entirely, there will be no one to make changes in our favor to the existing systems in place. Family Search, Ancestry, and programs like those make changes to their platform due to demand, not the company's moral standings. Queer stories are worthy of being included in the personal histories we tell. Genealogy is more than a record of lineages. Genealogy is a gateway to researching primary sources for a vast variety of topics. Genealogists make up a group of lay archivists and historians. They search the archives for personal stories. They make copies of records. They save family documents from the trash and preserve one-of-a-kind materials. In doing so, they create vast networks of records, personal accounts of the past. The particular process of genealogy blends archival work with sociological practices and creates a unique and personalized understanding of the past. Genealogy is a unique way of studying and understanding our own history. The way we tell the past also sets our normative expectations for life and future. Telling family stories connects distant generations. It humanizes history. and it helps us create the blueprints of our own family expectations. Queer folks are also worthy of and necessary to the telling of these stories. Doing queer genealogy requires you to read between the lines. Most of us won't find a queer love confession in black and white. What a treasure if you do. To research queer folks in their historical context, you'll also have to set aside your modern sensibilities about the right terminology. Queer theory reminds us that there's no one right term for queer lives, as these identities are shifting and contextual. Queer terminology and identification is constantly shifting and changing as society has grown more accepting of us expressing ourselves on our own terms. As a result, many of the terms you will encounter while doing queer genealogy may seem outdated or downright offensive to you. To research our queer ancestors responsibly, we need to take time to educate ourselves about the terminology levied against them. Many individuals' gender or sexuality was only reported by those judging them for being socially deviant. Understanding the terms used to describe our queer ancestors will help us recognize queerness when we see it in the archives, and also prevent us from trivializing some archaic terms that may seem silly to our modern ears. Terms like spinster, bachelor, or independent might not mean much to us now, while other terminology is outdated in a way to be offensive or confusing. Sodomy is a charge most of us dealing with queer records might recognize, but invert, buggery, public indecency, those may not ring queer alarm bells for us. Our trans ancestors may be found as masquerading as the opposite gender. Once we learn to look for our queer ancestors using the language applied to them, we can contextualize them in our own terminology, blending together the historical and modern to create our own queer pedigrees. The process of retelling history through minority eyes can be referred to as telling counterstories. This is a term taken from critical race theory. Counterstories are stories that oppose or counter the dominant narrative. More traditional CRT usage could look like talking about enslavement from the perspective of people of color, rather than glorifying plantations. In our context, queer genealogy, counterstories oppose the assumption that queer lives are a new phenomenon. Queer genealogy counters heteronormative views of the past by bringing attention to queer folks who, by nature of the world they lived in, had to hide much of themselves. This clandestine way of life makes it easier for the dominant culture and traditional genealogy to downplay the existence of queer folks in their families. Counterstories, however, acknowledge the way minorities often exist only in records of their disenfranchisement. For queer ancestors, this might mean finding them in prison or police records for breaking gender norms, reported on in the newspaper as deviants or freaks. By doing queer genealogy, we tell the counterstory that queer people of the past had vibrant lives, filled with love as well as sorrow. We lift up the everyday experiences of queer folks living their lives, working and loving. Queer genealogy builds evidence that queer people have always been and will continue to be. Now for the exciting part. Queer people can be found all over your family tree. I have a few real-life examples of queer ancestors from my own research. I hope these examples will help you see the possibilities of queer genealogy. Not just who you can find, but how queerness shows up in these records. Queer people of history were just as diverse as queer folks today are. You will find that their queerness shows up in a myriad of ways, across records and across time. Shorty was adopted by my biological relatives when he was 10 years old. I initially started out looking for his biological parents to include in his family tree, and ended up with quite a queer story. Shorty was born Sylvester Mahoney in Kentucky on May 1st, 1900. He is the youngest child of Arthur and Laura Mahoney. Shorty's parents had a troubled marriage full of domestic abuse. When his mother was finally able to divorce his father, she had to find new homes for her children. The older kids were quickly married off. Shorty, however, found a home with Dexter and Mary McMaster's family in northern Ohio. I thought that the McMasters adopted Shorty as farm labor, as their other 10 children were adults, and they were getting on there in years. However, he was clearly made a part of the family. The McMaster clan gave him his nickname, Shorty, and within a few years, he was also using their surname. William Sylvester Shorty McMaster is the name he was buried under. Now, Shorty never married, but he lived with his various siblings for the rest of his life. He worked as a law clerk and died suddenly one day on his way to work. It was through Shorty's death certificate that I unlocked the truly queer part of his story. Shorty was intersex. Now, of course, they didn't use that phrase in 1972 when he died, but that's what he was. Shorty was loved by both of his families and accepted for who he was. That's why I want to share his story. There were many opportunities for these families to reject Shorty for being different, and they did not. The only rejection I could find in Shorty's life was the US military, who said he was too short to serve. Today, you can find Shorty's grave in the McMaster family cemetery, part of the family in death as in life. Now, I agree, Shorty is a special case. You won't always find medical or social labels conveniently applied to your queer ancestors. More often than not, you'll find queer ancestors based on their queer behavior. You'll have to track patterns of queer life through census records, newspaper mentions, and other clues. Eva Strayer was born February 17, 1881, in North Manchester, Indiana, was a photographer. She bought her own studio in Huntington, Indiana in 1922. Her lifelong roommate, Nettie Overmeyer, was also an independent woman who worked as a stenographer. Both women were members of the local travel club, popular with unmarried working women of the city, and enjoyed going on long road trips in the automobile they shared together. The social column of the local paper also shows them spending time together regularly with both of their families. Eva and Nettie lived together. This can be documented through census records from the mid-1920s all the way until Eva's death. Now, when Eva died in 1972, Nettie was listed as the informant on her death certificate. Nettie had Eva laid to rest in the Oak Lawn Cemetery, where she would later join Eva on their joint tombstone. The descriptions of Eva and Nettie's relationship in official documents is that of roommates, lodgers, or even none, as on Eva's death certificate. However, the pattern of their shared lives and shared gravestone tells a different, unspoken story. Many of our queer ancestors will show up in documents this way. Close, but never connected. You'll have to connect the dots yourself. Now, there are many, many more queer and queer-leaning ancestors I could tell you about. What about you? How do you start looking for your own queer ancestors? Well, you might start with a person in your own biological tree who you suspect to be queer. This could be influenced by stories you've heard about this person. Sadly, our heteronormative biological families will often only speak of queer family members in whispers. Many of our queer elders will only feel safe coming out after their deaths. Telling queer stories after the passing can honor the life they felt they had to hide. Now, you might also choose someone from your family tree who had a queer-seeming life and see where your research takes you. This could be someone who remained single for their whole lives, lived with a roommate, did everything with a best friend of the same sex. They may have worked in an occupation unusual for their sex or gender presentation at the time in which they lived. Many queer lifestyles that passed under the radar decades ago stick out to us now. Choosing to research a biological relative is the easiest option if you have access to a family tree already started from which you can work. This is also the most traditional way of doing genealogy. And it can feel good to know that you have biological relatives who are also queer like you. However, queer genealogy does not have to follow your biological relationships. You can throw all those out the window and still build a queer family tree. A non-biological option is to adopt a queer ancestor. Remember, querying genealogy is about telling stories, not proving a bloodline. Free genealogy sites, like Family Search, are full of abandoned branches. Many of these people were abandoned for not being useful to the traditional heteronormative genealogist. This means they likely did not have a state-sanctioned marriage or bear children. However, many of these folks have queer histories that are waiting to be rediscovered. Social clubs, such as the travel club Eva and Nettie belong to, are also a good place to look for queer folks. Clubs filled with single adults who never married may have often been covert meeting spaces for queer dating. If you suspect you have a queer ancestor on your hands, look at the social activities they frequented. Old newspapers, many of which are available online. Don't forget to check your local library for a subscription to newspapers.com, or check out the Library of Congress's Chronicling American database, are full of social events. Newspapers were the social media of the past. They kept track of who did what, where, and with whom. These social gatherings also provide potential extended family networks for our queer ancestors that we can research and include in our queer stories. You can use traditional family trees, pedigree charts, and family group charts to track your queer ancestors. This may require some modification on your part, but the forms already exist and at least accommodate queerness in the most basic of ways. Creating your own family groups, timelines, scrapbooks, or even journaling your queer genealogy stories are other ways to document your research. However you choose to record your discoveries, by engaging in queer genealogy, you are preserving the lives of queer folk for generations to come. In looking back at our ancestors, we also look to the future in hopes for more queer families. I hope you're inspired to find your own queer ancestors. Together, we can shed light on queer families of the past and show that queer folks can and do thrive in every era.